Welcome to Scalloway, the ancient capital of the Shetland Islands. For centuries before the town of Lerwick rose to become Shetland's main borough, Scalloway here stood at the heart of life on these islands. And on this walk around the old capital, we'll make our way along the harbour front as we pass by colourful houses, grand hotels, charming shops and fetching public gardens. And we'll uncover the incredible stories of residents who lived in centuries-old cottages, locals who were involved on the night of the Titanic sinking in 1912, and the heroic tale of the Shetland Bus, a famous cross-sea convoy which was used to relieve the people of occupied Norway during the Second World War, and which departed from this very harbour. All of that is to come over the next 20 minutes. But we begin with what is by far Scalloway's most famous landmark, the castle, one of just 2 castles that you'll find across all of Shetland. Built more than 4 centuries ago in the year 1600, Scalloway Castle may nowadays be an icon of Shetland's old capital. But back when it was built, it was a building reviled by the locals, principally because of the man who ordered its construction. Scalloway Castle was built as a residence for a man named Patrick Stewart, the Earl of Orkney, who was widely seen by the people of Shetland as a petty tyrant. The effective ruler of both Orkney and Shetland, the Earl's main residence was located about 100 miles away from here in the Orcadian capital of Kirkwall. But in order to demonstrate his grip on power over the people here in Shetland, he decided to build a residence in the capital of Scalloway right here, using forced labour from the locals. For his cruelty, the Earl Patrick Stewart came to be known as Black Patty, and during his tumultuous reign, he sought to destroy the traditional way of life on these islands. But his rule ended in chaos after he organised a rebellion against the Scottish monarchy, and was eventually executed in 1615 for treason. For a few decades after his death, the castle here did remain in use, as a venue of local government, a jail, and a courthouse. However, by the 1670s, the castle had begun to fall into ruin, and given its hated reputation among locals, nobody around was keen to take care to repair it. Set among some spectacular Shetland scenery, the stones of Scalloway Castle which remain standing are indeed now preserved as an important historic landmark, and they stand just beside the place where history really comes to life in the old capital. Inside what was once an old woolen mill, we find Scalloway Museum, which tells the story of this famous settlement and its people through the ages, with a well-known exhibition on the link between this village and Norway during the Second World War, which we'll talk more about later. But such was Scalloway's role in assisting the Norwegians during the war, that the Prime Minister of Norway even came to open the museum here back in 2012. And around the streets of Scalloway, we'll also find plenty more examples of Norwegian heritage that showcase the village's lengthy history. Now, as you may know, before Shetland came under Scottish control in the 15th century, these islands were part of Norway, the Scandinavian nation lying just over 200 miles to the east across the North Sea, closer than the Scottish capital of Edinburgh. But as we get walking, we need to take a look at a map of Shetland to see where exactly Scalloway is located on these islands, that being inside a sheltered bay on the mainland, about 5 miles as the crow flies from the modern capital of Lerwick. Looking out towards the water, we can see the profile of the bay, as well as the islands of Burra and Trondra, which shelter Scalloway from the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. And these geographical features were integral in the early growth of this place into Shetland's main settlement centuries ago. Now, although Scalloway has very much been overtaken by Lerwick in size and significance, this place is still home to a population of around 1,000 people, some of whom live in gorgeously colourful houses like this terrace that we find on New Street, which, as the name suggests, is one of the newer streets you'll find here. New Street developed just under 400 years ago in the mid-17th century, a period in which Scalloway Harbour became ever busier with activity, and when Shetland's population began to grow like never before. This was the period when fleets of North Sea fishermen, principally from the Netherlands, began basing themselves in Shetland during the summer season. And while many indeed came to what was the island's main harbour, here in Scalloway, many instead chose to set down roots on the other side of the mainland, in Lerwick, which was easier to reach given that it faces directly out towards the North Sea and continental Europe. By contrast, Scalloway Harbour is accessed from Shetland's Atlantic coast, and while it may have consequently lost its title as capital to Lerwick, it remained a place of real significance, home to major residences like the large house that we see here. It's known as the Muckle Haa, a Scots name which literally means big hall, and it was built back in 1750 by the wealthy Sinclair family, who owned a vast area of land around Scalloway and on nearby Borough, and so they sought a prominent residence at the heart of their domain from which to conduct their business. The Sinclairs were one of many Scottish merchant families who came to Shetland in the aftermath of its transfer from Scandinavian rule to Scottish rule. And over the centuries, these families established their own haas, or halls, in places all over these islands. But just down beside Scalloway's Muckle Haa, we can see the remains of a much smaller dwelling. This was Mary Russland's cottage, a small stone house that may have started out as an outhouse belonging to the Muckle Haa, but which was later the residence of one Mary Russland in the mid-19th century. She was born out of wedlock in the 1850s, her mother a local Scalloway woman, and her father thought to be a Spanish sailor, one of many who based themselves at this port during the period. It's said that throughout her life, Mary Russland liked to lord it over her fellow residents in Scalloway, thinking herself superior to other Shetlanders on account of her Spanish blood. But what were Spanish sailors doing here in the first place? Well, at the time, Scalloway was home to a large number of fishermen who worked in the waters off the Faroe Islands, about 200 miles northwest of Shetland, where they fished principally for cod. This cod was then brought back to dry land and salted, using salt brought to Shetland on Spanish ships. And these Spanish ships then took home the salted cod for consumption in northern coastal areas, including the cities of Bilbao and Santander. It's likely that Mary Russland's father was one of the men who travelled on these ships, but she sadly never knew him. However, the story goes to show just how busy and international this Shetland settlement was during the heyday of the fisheries, with visitors from far and wide strolling along Scalloway's streets. Today, things tend to be a little quieter here, this village of around 1,000 people gently hugging the shore of the bay, in which trade once raged for centuries. As we know, this village rose to prominence as Shetland's capital during the island's Scandinavian age, long before the times of black patty and large-scale modern fishing. The Norse settlers who originally came here and developed the settlement gave it the name Skålavågur, which can be roughly translated as the Bay of the Huts, indicating that this was an especially well-settled area of the Shetland Islands. Over time, Skålavågur gradually became Scalloway, the name that we know today. And just across Scalloway's main street here, you'll find a relatively unusual sight in Shetland. A garden busy with trees. Famously, Shetland's landscape is largely barren of trees, most cut down centuries ago by early Norse settlers. But Scalloway, surrounded to the east and west by large hills, and thereby sheltered from the harsh winds coming off the sea, has a bit of a microclimate, where trees can more easily grow. And so the residents of this village are well known for their love of horticulture, with many more fetching gardens to be found on the surrounding streets. Indeed, despite the cloudy weather on this day, Scalloway is a village which is full of colour. Its main street here contrasting with some of the more austere stonework on Lerwick's commercial street. For instance, in a pleasant green just here is the Scalloway Hotel, which was built back in 1886 on the harbour front, originally to host passengers on the steamboat linking Scalloway with Stromness in Orkney, Aberdeen and Leith in Edinburgh. That was a weekly ferry service which operated until 1940. But the hotel has since remained a popular place to stay in Scalloway, family run and home to a bar and restaurant, as well as 23 rooms, a number of which offer wonderful views out over the harbour. Now, when visiting Shetland, many people may choose to stay in the island's modern capital just 5 miles away. But Scalloway has a distinctive charm, its lengthy history lending it an old-world atmosphere that's clear as day when strolling along the waterfront, as gaps appear between the houses where boats have historically been loaded into the water. Indeed, as the island's old capital, it was here in Scalloway that everybody, from Viking settlers to Scottish merchants, international fishermen and more, would have made their very first steps in Shetland. And although once upon a time almost all of the houses would have been directly positioned on the waterfront, as the village's population has grown, so have its streets spread further inland. Here we're strolling along Chapel Lane, which takes its name from the building just up ahead, the Scalloway Methodist Church, which was built all the way back in 1861. It's one of no less than 3 places of worship that you'll find on Scalloway's streets, which, as we mentioned, may extend away from the harbourfront today, but if you keep walking inland for a couple more streets, you'll find yourself straight back in the countryside. Such is the size of settlements in Shetland, you're never far from boundless nature. And whilst we return to the waterfront, the surrounding landscape was another key element in Scalloway's rise to prominence early in history. We know that the profile of the bay, sheltered from the winds of the sea, was a major reason for settlement here. But just a few miles inland, you'll find the waters of Tingwall Loch, a huge lake which lies at the bottom of a valley and feeds fertile lands in this area. These lands were ideally suited for agriculture, which is not all too common across Shetland's vast landscape, and so they provided people living here with a source of nutrition alongside fish from the sea. By the turn of the 18th century, when Lerwick took over as Shetland's capital, there were likely no more than a couple of hundred people living here, and most of the population growth came in the following century or so on the back of fishing. And as more people moved into Scalloway, they began needing a church, big enough to host the village's swelling population. Enter the building that we see before us here, known locally as the Muckle Kirk. Once again, that's Scots for big church, and it was built back in 1842, with space for around 350 people. This was an important development, because before the Muckle Kirk was built, the nearest church to Scalloway was 3 miles away at Tingwall, and people had to walk all the way there and back in order to worship. But just across the road from the church is a monument remembering a time of much greater hardship, the Second World War, when Scalloway here was a lifeline for people living in occupied territories in mainland Europe. This monument is dedicated to the Shetland Bus, a name which was collectively used for the fishing boats that set out from this harbour and sailed across the sea to the coast of Norway, which had been invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany in 1940. Manned by enthusiastic volunteers, the Shetland Bus had 2 main purposes: to relieve the Norwegians and to sabotage the Germans. Carrying supplies to those living under occupation and bringing back with them refugees and freedom fighters who sought to escape the Nazis, the bus travelled back and forth between these islands and Norway across dark and stormy seas, with small fishing boats used to evade detection by German boats patrolling the waters of the North Sea. Sadly, scores of people aboard the boats of the Shetland Bus lost their lives during the crossings, but they played a vital part in turning the tide of the war. Most famously, the Shetland Bus carried radio equipment into Norway that was used to connect with Allied forces. During this time, regular transmissions were made detailing Allied plans to invade Norway as part of their counterattack against the Nazis, a ruse which led the Germans to commit more men and resources to defending the Norwegian coast, and which ultimately helped to draw German forces away from Normandy for when the D-Day landings came along in 1944. The Shetland Bus is one of many stories from the war that undoubtedly helped the Allies to victory, and as we've seen, the Norwegians fondly remember its role to this day. But it's not the only story of Scalloway that's worth mentioning. Just here we're looking at a mighty building which is the home of the Walter and Joan Gray Care Home, a retirement home that was donated to the local community by Scalloway native Walter Gray and his wife Joan, who retired here after a busy life. Walter Gray had had a successful career in communications in the early 20th century, and in April of 1912 he was the man operating the communication radio linking between a station in Canada and a boat called the RMS Titanic, which was undertaking its maiden crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. The fate of the Titanic is well known, but after it struck the iceberg, it was Gray's job to maintain radio communication with the ship for as long as possible, speaking with his good friend Jack Phillips in charge of the radio on board the ship. Sadly, Phillips died in the sinking, alongside roughly 1,500 others, and decades later, Walter Gray returned to his hometown here in Scalloway. Now, just before the story of Walter Gray, we mentioned how the Norwegians fondly remember the role of the Shetland Bus during the Second World War. But here in Scalloway, the Norwegians are just as fondly remembered by Shetlanders. Stretching out into the harbour in front of us here is the Prince Olav Slipway, so named after it was visited by Olav, the Crown Prince of Norway, in October of 1942. Indeed, many of the people who had fled Norway immediately after the invasion in 1940 didn't simply go into hiding. They were the volunteers who operated the boats of the Shetland Bus. And so Scalloway, and plenty of other ports around Shetland, would have seen a large number of Norwegians walking the streets during the course of the war. Prince Olav, later King Olav V of Norway, had fled to Britain alongside his father, then King Haakon VII, after the Germans invaded Norway. And the royal family served as vital flag bearers for the Norwegian resistance movement around Europe, with visits to key centres of resistance, like Shetland here, providing a real boost to all the volunteers putting their lives on the line for their country. As we can see, there are plenty of buildings and landmarks in Scalloway today which are named for important Norwegian figures. And just at the end of Main Street here, there's even a building which is named Norway House. Originally used as a storehouse for sails for ships in the late 19th century, during the Second World War this red building was the place where many of the Norwegian volunteers involved in the Shetland Bus lived. Temporary accommodation just beside the harbour, where their perilous voyages across the sea began and ended. During the war, life in Scalloway must have been dominated by the activity of this covert operation. So much so that the village is just as closely associated today with the Shetland Bus as it is with its many centuries of history as Shetland's capital. Just a few of the incredible stories to be found in this small but endlessly riveting settlement. However, it's here at the end of Main Street that we've sadly come to the end of our walk around Scalloway. As we take a look out across the bay, the waters of which have witnessed so much of Shetland's history, I'll say thank you very much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're planning your own visit to Scalloway, the ancient capital of Shetland, sometime soon.